On the 1st of November, 2025, the President of the United States sat down at his desk and opened Truth Social. What followed was not a tweet, it was a declaration. Nigeria, he typed, is out of control. Christian killings by Islamic terrorists continue unchecked. The Nigerian government has failed its people. I am ordering the Department of War to prepare for action, boots on the ground or airstrikes, to eliminate terror and restore order. This is humanitarian intervention. This is what America does. The post went live at 7:43 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. By 8:15, it had been shared across every major newsroom on Earth. By 9, the streets of Lagos were already beginning to stir with a fury that would not sleep for weeks. 1,500 civilians. That is how many have died in northern Nigeria since January of this year alone, according to the United Nations. 1,500 mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, caught between Boko Haram's black flags and the Nigerian Army's green berets. The violence is not new. What is new is the language coming from Washington. Not partnership, not cooperation, but intervention. The kind that begins with concern and ends with control. When America says it comes to protect, whose lives does it really save? If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not leave. Like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe, not for us, but to keep the flame of dignity burning. Because 4 days after that post, on the 5th of November, the New York Times published a leak. It was small, buried in a late-night update, barely a paragraph long, but it detonated across the world like a delayed fuse. The document outlined 3 versions of the same promise: intervention, heavy, medium, light. 3 ways to enter Nigeria. 3 ways to decide the fate of 200 million people without asking them first. And at the center of every option was a single sentence that would haunt the halls of Abuja for weeks to come. U.S. forces will assume operational command. Nigeria did not know, but the Pentagon did. And somewhere in the Gulf of Guinea, engines were already turning. Sunday, the 5th of November, 2025. The New York Times story went live just after midnight. It was not long, 900 words, maybe less, but every sentence carried weight. The headline was surgical. U.S. considers military options for northern Nigeria. Inside, the article laid out what officials in Stuttgart, Germany, home to the United States Africa Command, known as AFRICOM, had been drafting in private for weeks. 3 plans, 3 futures, 3 ways to rewrite sovereignty with the stroke of a pen. The first option was called heavy. It read like something from the Cold War playbook, a relic of the days when deterrence meant spectacle. A carrier strike group would enter the Gulf of Guinea within 10 days. Long-range bombers, likely B-2 Spirits, the kind that vanish from radar and reappear over target zones thousands of miles away, would launch strikes on insurgent camps in Borno and Yobe. The targets would be chosen by American intelligence alone. No Nigerian oversight, no shared command, no pause for consultation. The Pentagon had a phrase for it: rapid precision engagement. But for anyone who remembered Libya in 2011, it sounded like another way of saying shock and regret. The second option was cleaner on paper, deadlier in practice. Predator and Reaper drones would orbit the skies of northern Nigeria, mapping terrain, identifying high-value individuals, and conducting remote strikes as needed. It was the kind of war America preferred now: invisible, quiet, deniable. The kind that rarely shows up on front pages until the mistakes do. In Somalia, this model had already caused over 1,000 civilian deaths since 2019. Human rights groups had been screaming about it for years. The question no one in Washington wanted to answer was simple. If the United States could not distinguish farmers from fighters in the Horn of Africa, what would make Nigeria different? The third option looked cooperative. American advisors would embed with Nigerian military units, sharing intelligence, technology, and tactical guidance. It was a model tested in Mali a decade earlier, a model that ended with a coup, a fractured army, and a nation still bleeding. The memo acknowledged this risk in a footnote, but concluded that limited engagement carried acceptable costs. Acceptable to whom? It did not say. Each proposal had a different price tag. Each had a different body count projected in classified annexes. But they all shared one thing. Not a single word about rebuilding once the dust settled. Not a single line about what happens when foreign troops leave and local grievances remain. Just 3 versions of arrival, 3 scripts for intervention, 3 ways to start something no one knew how to finish. At the bottom of the leaked document was a date. The commander of AFRICOM, General Dagvin R. Anderson, would visit Nigeria within the month to discuss options. And beneath that, a note so brief it almost disappeared. Naval assets repositioning for regional exercises. By Sunday afternoon, satellite tracking websites had confirmed it. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Nimitz-class supercarrier capable of launching 90 aircraft and projecting force across a radius of over 1,000 miles, had been spotted moving westward into the Gulf of Guinea. Officially, it was routine coordination. Unofficially, it was a message written in steel and jet fuel. In Lagos, radio hosts read excerpts of the leak over morning coffee. Callers flooded the lines. Truck drivers, students, ex-soldiers, voices crackling with static and emotion. Some begged for American help. If they don't come, one man said, his voice shaking, the terrorists will never stop. My sister was killed in Plateau. My cousin disappeared in Kaduna. We need someone who can fight. Others shouted back, their anger raw and unfiltered. If they come, Nigeria will never be the same. You think they care about us? Look at Libya, look at Iraq. They come for oil, not for justice. On social media, the debate became a storm. Videos of past American interventions were spliced together with satellite images of the Gulf of Guinea, where the carrier was reportedly refueling. A hashtag began to trend, Operation Second Berlin. It was a reference to the Berlin Conference of 1884, when European powers sat around a table and divided Africa with ink and arrogance. The comparison was not subtle, neither was the rage. Meanwhile, in Washington, a Pentagon press briefing turned tense. A journalist from Reuters stood up and asked the spokesperson a direct question. Is the United States preparing to deploy military forces in Nigeria? The answer was rehearsed, polished, empty. We are exploring options to assist our partners in addressing regional security challenges. But when pressed further, do those options include airstrikes? The official paused. 2 seconds, maybe 3. It felt longer. That silence echoed louder than any confirmation. Human rights organizations immediately issued warnings. The so-called precision campaigns in Somalia, Yemen, and Afghanistan had killed thousands of civilians. Reports from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism documented case after case of weddings mistaken for militant gatherings, farmers mistaken for fighters, children mistaken for threats. If the technology failed there, what guarantee did Nigeria have? Inside Nigeria, a senior military officer admitted off the record to a local journalist, "Once they arrive, we cannot tell them to leave." That is the problem with invitation. It becomes occupation before you realize what you have signed. At this point, I want to invite you into something bigger than watching. Leave a thank you in the comments. It might be, "Thank you, Traoré," or "Thank you, Burkina Faso," or simply thank you for hope. Why? Because each thank you carries weight. Each thank you says, I hear this, I feel this, I stand with this. Imagine hundreds of people adding their thanks. It turns a video into a movement. So write your thank you now and let your voice be part of this shared journey. Night fell over Abuja under a nervous calm. Television anchors repeated phrases like regional stability and joint security cooperation. But every time the word joint appeared on screen, it felt less like partnership and more like a permission slip. By the end of the broadcast, one image stayed with everyone watching. A map of West Africa lit by drone flight paths, white lines crossing borders that once meant sovereignty. And beneath it, a question written in small letters, easy to miss but impossible to ignore. Who draws these lines now? Nigeria had been told for decades that peace required foreign partnership, that progress needed permission, that safety could only come from somewhere else. But history had taught a different lesson. Every time Africa leaned on someone else's strength, it woke up weaker. Every time it traded sovereignty for security, it found itself with neither. From Bamako to Ouagadougou, leaders were watching. They had seen this script before. They knew how it ended. By Monday morning, the streets would answer, not with silence, with fire.
Monday, the 6th of November. Dawn broke over Abuja with the weight of inevitability. The sky was gray, thick with the kind of heat that sits heavy on the lungs. But the streets were already moving. By 7 in the morning, crowds had begun to gather outside the National Assembly. Men in faded uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder with market women, students, and street preachers. Their voices rose like a single wave, crashing against the gates of power with a demand that needed no translation. No foreign boots, no new masters. Hand-painted signs dotted the crowd, each one a small monument to dignity. Our pain is not your mission. Nigeria is not for sale. We survived Biafra. We will survive this. One banner stretched across 6 people read simply, sovereignty or death. The words were not a threat. They were a choice already made. From Abuja, the anger spread. In Lagos, students blocked the 3rd mainland bridge, bringing traffic to a standstill for hours. In Kano, traders closed their stalls and marched to the governor's office, chanting slogans in Hausa that translated to one idea: we are not a theater for your wars. In Maiduguri, where Boko Haram's shadow still loomed over every market and mosque, protesters carried pictures of loved ones killed not by insurgents, but by drone strikes gone wrong. Underneath each photo, a single word: collateral. On social media, 2 hashtags began to dominate the conversation. The first was straightforward, #NoForeignBoots. The second was sharper, more historical, more painful, #Operation Second Berlin. It was a deliberate echo of the Berlin Conference, the moment when Africa's borders were carved by men who had never set foot on its soil. The comparison was clear. If America entered Nigeria without consent, it would not be intervention. It would be annexation by another name. Inside the halls of the National Assembly, the debate was brutal. Senators shouted over one another, their voices bouncing off marble walls built to project authority, but now filled only with chaos. One senator, his face red with fury, slammed his fist on the table so hard the microphone crackled. "Every American soldier who lands here," he said, his voice trembling with rage, "is another nail in the coffin of our independence. We fought the British, we survived military dictators, and now we are supposed to invite in another power that will decide our fate for us? Over my dead body."
Another senator stood to respond, his tone quieter but no less intense. Without their drones, Boko Haram will swallow us whole. You talk about sovereignty as if it matters when our people are being slaughtered in their sleep. What good is independence if we are all dead? The room split, not along party lines, not along regional allegiances, but along memory. Those who remembered colonialism, or whose parents had told them stories of it, stood on one side. Those who had only read about it in textbooks stood on the other. And in the middle, a generation caught between survival and surrender. Outside the assembly, the smell of tear gas mixed with rain. Police in riot gear faced a sea of umbrellas and flags. Someone in the crowd shouted, pointing at the sky, "They are already here!" A gray aircraft streaked overhead, silent and fast. Perhaps it was commercial, perhaps not. No one knew. But phones went up, recording, just in case. Within minutes, the footage was online. Within an hour, it had been viewed over 200,000 times. In Port Harcourt, a man named Joseph stood at the edge of a dockyard, watching oil tankers rise and fall with the tide. He was 35, a marine engineer, once proud of the work he did keeping Nigeria's rigs alive. But now the ships carried fewer barrels and more tension. "I have seen this movie before," he said quietly to a colleague. "When the Americans say they are here to protect us, the prices go up and the peace goes down." He remembered 2011 when the Libya campaign began. Crude oil prices spiked overnight. Contracts froze. Thousands of Nigerian workers were sent home without severance, their livelihoods erased by a war fought thousands of miles away. "Protection," Joseph muttered, staring at the horizon, "always costs more than it pays." Far to the north, in Maiduguri, a woman named Halima kept 2 photographs in the pocket of her dress, her sons, 12 and 14 when they died. 3 years ago, a drone strike had missed its target, a suspected militant hideout, and hit a school instead. 23 children died that day. The official report called it an unfortunate misidentification. Halima called it something else, a foreign mistake we paid for in blood. When she heard on the radio that more drones were coming, she turned off the dial and whispered to herself, barely audible over the hum of a broken ceiling fan, "No one protects us from the protectors." In a dim cafe in Abuja, under flickering fluorescent lights, a retired Nigerian officer stirred his tea. He was in his 60s now, gray-haired and tired, but his eyes still carried the sharpness of someone who had seen too much to be fooled by words. He had once trained with American advisors during a counterterrorism program in Mali. They called it partnership, he said, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his cup. But they gave the orders. We took the blame. He opened an old notebook, its pages yellowed and creased. Inside were coordinates, code names, mission briefings from operations he was not allowed to talk about. "Every time we thought we were winning," he said, tracing a finger over faded ink, "the mission changed. New targets, new priorities. And when it went wrong, they disappeared. We stayed. We buried the bodies. We answered to the families." He paused, closing the notebook slowly. When a country fights someone else's war, it cannot win its own. 3 voices, 3 stories, 1 truth. A nation suspended between fear and pride, between the violence it knows and the violence it fears. That night, an image surfaced online, grainy but clear enough. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, massive and unmistakable, moving slowly through the waters of the Gulf of Guinea. Officially, it was there for joint naval exercises. Unofficially, it was a message. We are here. We are close. We are waiting. The next morning, a government spokesman appeared on national television, his face composed but his eyes darting nervously. He called the protests misguided and influenced by online misinformation. He insisted that Nigeria's sovereignty was intact, that no foreign troops would land without permission, that the rumors of American intervention were exaggerated. But his words rang hollow against the noise of the streets. At a university in Lagos, a young woman studying political science spoke to a local reporter. Her voice was calm, but her message was sharp. "They say we are unstable," she said, adjusting her glasses. "But how can you be stable when someone else keeps shaking the table?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Because the truth was, Nigeria had been told the same story for decades, that peace required foreign help, that sovereignty was a luxury only stable nations could afford, that independence without power was just a word in an anthem. But now, millions were beginning to ask, what if partnership without equality is just another kind of control? As dusk fell, the city lights of Abuja flickered with another power cut. Yet in that darkness, a new kind of clarity emerged. The realization that sovereignty is not lost in a single invasion. It fades one agreement at a time, one compromise at a time, one permission slip at a time. And somewhere above the Atlantic, drones began their slow circling flight, silent, patient, waiting for the word, go. The ships remained offshore, the drones still circled, but for now, no boots had touched the sand. The only thing moving was the question that refused to die.
Fuel prices climbed, markets thinned out, rumors multiplied like weeds after rain. Merchants whispered that foreign military bases might return to the country, that American contractors were already scouting land near the Niger Delta, that the drones seen flying over Borno at night were not Nigerian. Taxi drivers joked, nervous, bitter jokes, that soon they would have to pay tolls to drones instead of police checkpoints. But beneath the jokes lay a deeper unease. For ordinary Nigerians, the threat was not just war. It was the quiet erosion of agency. Each promise of protection pushed the country a little further from deciding its own fate. Each agreement signed in the name of security made the next one easier to justify. And every time a foreign power said, "We are here to help," the question became, help us do what? Survive or obey? On television, experts debated regional stability in air-conditioned studios. In living rooms across the country, people wondered if stability was just another word for silence. A preacher in Kaduna told his congregation on Sunday morning, his voice echoing through a chapel packed beyond capacity, "A borrowed shield will still break in your hands, and when it does, you will bleed twice, once from the enemy, once from the hand that held the shield." The congregation murmured in agreement. They had heard the promises before. They had seen the pattern. Aid that came with conditions, loans that came with interest, protection that came with surveillance. Meanwhile, deep in Washington, analysts presented slides to senators in windowless committee rooms. The slides showed Nigeria as a strategic partner with rising instability. Charts displayed insurgent activity in red, oil reserves in green, and American interests in blue. To the analysts, it was data. To Nigerians, it was a future already being priced. A leaked internal report, one that never made it past the clearance desk, revealed another layer. Alongside the intervention plans, there was a new United States energy initiative projected to increase Gulf of Guinea extraction by 40% over the next decade. The overlap was not lost on anyone reading between the lines. One Pentagon advisor had written in the margins of the document, "We cannot save a people by controlling their resources." The memo was never cleared. The initiative moved forward anyway. As night settled over the country, Joseph closed the shipyard gates in Port Harcourt, the metal clanging with finality. Halima in Maiduguri blew out her candle, her son's photographs still in her pocket. The retired officer in Abuja finished his tea, closed his notebook, and walked home through streets that felt heavier than they had the day before. None of them knew that hundreds of miles offshore, the USS Eisenhower drifted silently. Its deck lights were off. Its engines were idling. Its crew was awaiting orders that might arrive before dawn. The cameras would not capture it, but history often begins this way, in whispers, in waiting, in the quiet moments before someone decides to act. Take a second, right here, to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your land, the soil beneath your feet. And as you do, know this: One Nation Africa sends you not just thanks, but a blessing. For strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, for light on the road ahead. The comments below become a map of connection, showing that this message reaches far beyond borders. 3 voices had spoken: Joseph, Halima, and the officer. 3 lives shaped by interventions that promised salvation but delivered scars. They were not alone. Across Nigeria, millions carried similar stories. And across Africa, the pattern repeated like a drumbeat that never stops. But this time, something felt different. The protests were not just about war. They were about memory, about dignity, about the right to define what safety means without someone else holding the pen.
In Washington, the map of Africa glowed on a digital wall inside a secure briefing room. Lines traced oil routes, drone flight corridors, and red zones of instability. A voice from the Defense Department said flatly, as if reading from a script no one had bothered to rewrite, "Nigeria is too big to ignore." Another voice, quieter but sharper, replied, "It is also too proud to ask." The debate crossed oceans. In Paris, French diplomats whispered of déjà vu. France had been pushed out of Mali in 2022, expelled from Niger in 2023, and now watched as the United States stepped into the same burning corridor it once called its backyard. A columnist in Le Monde wrote with barely concealed bitterness, "The empire changes flags, not methods." Another French official, speaking off the record to a journalist from Liberation, sighed. "We lost the Sahel to ourselves, our arrogance, our blindness. Let us see if America learns faster. I doubt it." In Beijing, the reaction was quieter but sharper. Chinese envoys met with Nigerian officials in Abuja, offering what they called infrastructure support, a phrase that meant roads, ports, and contracts. Their message was subtle but unmistakable. We build, they bomb. It was diplomacy as competition, influence as investment, and Nigeria, caught between powers, listened carefully. On Al Jazeera, a Nigerian scholar spoke with measured frustration, choosing each word like a stone thrown at a wall that never cracks. "Every time Africa stands up," he said, his voice steady but strained, "someone outside calls it instability. Every time we try to govern ourselves, it is called chaos. Maybe the problem is not our weakness. Maybe it is their fear of our strength." At the United Nations, an emergency session was called. The chamber filled with delegates, translators, and the low hum of political theater. The United States ambassador stood at the podium and reaffirmed his country's commitment to stability and civilian protection. His words were polished, rehearsed, empty of anything resembling doubt. The Russian delegate responded without hesitation. "You said the same thing before Libya." The chamber fell silent. Not because anyone disagreed, but because everyone knew it was true. The Chinese representative followed. Peace cannot be delivered by drones. Another silence, longer this time. No one applauded. No one had to. The truth does not need applause. It just needs to be spoken. Back in the United States, the reaction was split down familiar fault lines. Cable news networks framed the potential intervention as a necessary stand against terror. Fox News ran segments with titles like America's Duty in Africa and Why Nigeria Needs Us. Retired generals appeared on screen, pointing at maps, explaining strike zones, using phrases like surgical precision and minimal collateral. But the Washington Post published an editorial warning of another endless desert, a war without exit, a mission without end. The New York Times interviewed veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, men and women who had come home broken by wars that were supposed to be quick. One veteran, speaking from a wheelchair in Ohio, said simply, "We were told we were liberators. We became occupiers. Do not make that mistake again." Veterans groups across the country issued open letters begging Congress not to send American sons and daughters into another invisible war. One letter, signed by over 3,000 former service members, included a line that went viral. "We fought for freedom, not for oil dressed up as rescue." Public opinion divided. Security versus conscience, patriotism versus pragmatism. And somewhere in the middle, exhaustion. A late-night television host summed it up with a joke that landed too close to truth. "We call it helping, but somehow the body count never helps anyone." The audience laughed, nervous, brief, then silent. On social media, one tweet from a Nigerian activist went viral, shared over 500,000 times. They said it is an exercise. We have seen this exercise before. Dr. Walid Fares, a Middle East analyst with over 300,000 followers, posted a detailed thread analyzing the positioning of United States military bases around Africa. His tweet included a map showing Djibouti, Niger, now closed, and potential sites in Nigeria. The post received over 300,000 views in 48 hours. The comment section became a battleground of opinions, but one theme repeated. Why is America always at the center of someone else's crisis? And while the world argued, satellites confirmed it. A United States carrier strike group had entered the Gulf of Guinea for what officials called joint naval exercises. No footage was released, no flags were raised, no confirmation was given. Only the faint radar signature of something massive moving just beyond territorial waters.
From Bamako to Ouagadougou, leaders echoed a growing sentiment: self-determination over dependency. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, had once stood before the United Nations and said, his voice calm but unyielding, "Without Africa's dignity, there can be no global balance." His words had been dismissed at the time as rhetoric, the passionate but impractical idealism of a revolutionary. But now, as Nigeria stood on the edge of intervention, those words sounded less like rhetoric and more like a warning. Traoré had said what many African leaders had thought but dared not speak: that sovereignty is not a gift granted by the powerful. It is a right claimed by the brave. And in Nigeria, bravery was no longer optional. It was survival. In Abuja, lights flickered again. The city held its breath, waiting to see whether the next headline would start with the words, "Mission begins." Satellites confirmed it, a carrier strike group. No footage, no flags, only the faint radar signature of something massive moving just beyond territorial waters.
And while the world argued, Nigeria held its breath.
Dawn broke over Abuja, thin and gray, the kind of light that offers no warmth, only visibility. The city woke to another day of waiting, waiting for news, for decisions made in rooms it would never see, for history to be written by hands that were not its own. On the horizon, the Gulf of Guinea glimmered faintly, hiding ships too far to touch, yet close enough to matter. Nigeria, once called the giant of Africa, now felt like a question mark. A nation rich in soil, oil, and spirit, but trapped between global intentions and its own uncertainty. Every generation here had been told the same story, that peace must come from somewhere else, that progress needs permission, that safety is something borrowed, never owned. But this time, something felt different. The protests were not just about war. They were about memory, dignity, and the right to define what safety means. A retired schoolteacher in Kaduna spoke on local radio, her voice calm but resolute. We have survived dictators and droughts. We have survived famine and war. What we cannot survive is the idea that we need saving forever. Across Africa, others listened. From Burkina Faso to Mali, a new generation was refusing the old script. They remembered what happened when nations traded sovereignty for security. They remembered the price. In Lagos, under rain that fell like judgment, a young protester held up a sign. The cardboard was soaked, the ink running, but the words were still legible. We don't hate America. We just love ourselves enough to say no. The camera lingered on her face, soaked, defiant, tired. Behind her, others joined. Farmers with calloused hands, teachers with worn textbooks, soldiers in faded uniforms, each carrying their own version of no. Because sometimes saying no is the loudest way a nation can speak. For all its politics and calculations, intervention has always been a moral mirror. It reflects what nations believe about themselves. That power equals virtue. That violence can birth order. That the strong have the right, even the duty, to shape the destiny of the weak. But history has shown otherwise. Somalia, Iraq, Libya. Each began as a promise to protect. Each ended with a generation asking what protection was worth. Now, as the United States weighed its next move, Nigeria stood on the edge of that same pattern and looked down. Would it step back or fall into the script already written for it? Ibrahim Traoré had stood before the world and said what many African leaders had thought but dared not speak. Our dignity is not negotiable. From Burkina Faso to Nigeria, that message was no longer whispered. It was shouted. The ships remained offshore. The drones still circled. But for now, no missile had been launched. No boots had touched the sand. The only thing moving was the question that refused to die. If sovereignty has a price, who should pay it? Those who live here or those who fly above? As we prepare to end, remember, this is not the end of the road, but a seed planted in the soil of your heart. Every story of dignity, every voice of sovereignty is part of a harvest that lies ahead. If you want to see that harvest grow, subscribe. Let this channel be the road we walk together, the light we carry forward. Your subscription is not for us alone. It is for the promise of what is still to come. Join us and be ready for the next chapter that is already waiting to be written.
No missiles, no announcements, no victory speeches, just silence. The kind that feels heavier than sound. In Abuja, the city lights flickered back to life after another power cut. Markets reopened. Children walked to school under skies that hummed faintly with unseen engines. Nothing had happened, yet everything had changed.
Nigeria had become the center of a question the world keeps avoiding. Can peace be delivered from a distance? For decades, Africa has been the stage for someone else's definition of order. Each promise of protection carried a shadow. Each intervention claimed to bring light, yet left behind dust and death. Now, perhaps, the continent is beginning to answer for itself. In the calm before whatever comes next, a sense of clarity lingers. Peace without sovereignty is just another kind of occupation. And sovereignty without courage is just a word in the anthem. Ibrahim Traoré stood before the world and said what many African leaders had thought but dared not speak. Our dignity is not negotiable. From Burkina Faso to Nigeria, that message is no longer whispered. It is shouted. It is painted on signs. It is chanted in streets. It is carried in the pockets of mothers who have buried children. It is etched in the notebooks of soldiers who have fought wars they did not start. Somewhere in the Gulf, the carrier still waits. Engines idle, radar spinning, a floating metaphor for hesitation. Somewhere inland, people pray, not for rescue, but for recognition. The protesters' words echo across the rain-soaked streets of Lagos. We don't hate America, we just love ourselves enough to say no. This story is not about Nigeria alone. It is about how nations decide who deserves to be free and who deserves to be protected. It is about the quiet dignity of those who refuse to be defined by someone else's fear. It is about the choice between safety and sovereignty, between intervention and independence, between being saved and being seen. So we ask again, when America says it comes to protect, who does it really protect? Tell us what you think. Does intervention bring stability or does it steal sovereignty? Your voice, not theirs, should answer that. Some details in this video are based on reports and analytical interpretation. This narrative does not represent any political stance.